hope you enjoy this sweet interview with Johnette Walser. Johnette shared about the impact of not making space to grieve in organizations. She shares about her experience of witnessing people grieve behind closed doors instead of normalizing the experience of grief. Johnette shares about her practice of remembering that even if she is in an experience where she isn't directly harmed, she remembers her connection with others and how all harm affects her. I'm excited about Johnette. She's one of the facilitators for the Healing in Community retreat taking place in Asheville, North Carolina in June. Johnette Walser is a yoga and mindfulness teacher, a social worker, a change agent, Reiki provider, space holder, and birth postpartum doula. Her background is in social work, and she has served as a mental health provider and practitioner of various different holistic healing disciplines. She has a bachelor's degree in social work from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro and a master's degree in social work from the Joint MSW program at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro and NCANT State University. She is a graduate of the Skill in Action Yoga and Social Justice 200-hour yoga teacher training program, and she has additional training in mindfulness-based stress reduction and other mindfulness techniques. She uses this knowledge to facilitate workshops, small groups, and individual healing for school-aged children and the educators who work with them. I hope you enjoy the interview. Hi, Johnette.
Hi, how are you?
I'm all right. It's good to see you.
It's good to see you.
Thank you for saying yes to this conversation about grief and liberation, and for saying yes to being one of the facilitators for the in-person Healing and Community retreat, which will take place in June.
Thank you so much for asking. I'm extremely excited to be part of both of those.
Yeah, me too. So we met in January of 2018, so it's almost been 2 years, when I came through Winston, Salem, where I live now, and you live in Greensboro. And I led a skill and action workshop. And I remember you in that workshop, and the folks in that room became my community. And so I'm really honored to call you a friend and to have you in my life and to sit in a lot of goddess circles with you in my living room with Jasper, doing magic and pulling cards. Yeah, I'm really happy you're part of my life and that we met each other.
Aw, me too. Extremely, extremely happy.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to invite us to just take a moment to center and settle before we dive into the conversation. So you can find a comfortable way to be in your body, and I'll close my eyes. You can if you'd like, you don't have to. And the folks who are watching or listening can find a comfortable way to be. And we'll just take a moment to connect with the breath so you can begin to feel your inhales and exhales. And now just take a moment to deepen and lengthen your breath and your body. And take a moment to notice how you feel physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. Notice what is present for you at this time. And now just take a moment to connect with your heart space and notice what you're holding in your heart or what is present in your heart right now. And take a few more deep breaths here.
And then as you feel ready, you can open your eyes and just take a moment to reorient to the space. So I would love for you to share some about what you do in the world, your work and your practice, and yeah, what you do in the world.
So I am a social worker by trade. That is what I have both my bachelor's and my master's degree in. And currently I work with school-age children and educators in that capacity as a social worker. But I also recently completed your wonderful Skill in Action 200-hour teacher training. So I'm slowly sort of getting comfortable with calling myself a yoga teacher. I'm also doing work around mindfulness and meditation. And in addition to that, I'm a Reiki provider and a birth and postpartum doula. So all of the things.
All the things, so many things. Yeah.
Yeah. All of which I think are really connected to, health and wholeness and healing. And so I feel really aligned in all of that work. And I'm excited to be doing all of it.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you're doing it, doing the work in the world, and making it the world a little better, a better place to be. So I mentioned you're one of the facilitators for the in-person retreat in June. And as you know, the conversation and the work is going to be about collective grief and liberation. And so I'm wondering if you could share some about why you feel like it's important to have a conversation or to make space to grieve in community and to heal in community.
I think it's important because we are just not really having those conversations. Not only are we not having those conversations about individual losses that we may experience, so losses of loved ones, of pets, losses of relationships in any capacity. We're also not having those conversations around the changes that are going on in the world that are impacting us all and that I think are really causing us to grieve, but we often are not aware of the reactions that we have to these changes as actual grief because we're so disconnected from that word. We're so disconnected from what grieving actually is. And so when I talk about those changes, I'm talking about things like global warming, like animals going extinct, I'm talking about, our rights being taken away and our way of life eroding. For some of us, I feel like, a lot of those things have always been the case, especially if we're walking around the world in a Black or a brown body or a disabled body or part of, Indigenous communities or LGBTQ communities. But I think about things like police brutality, and I think about all of these things that we are becoming more and more aware of because of social media and the way that those things are impacting our lives. And it seems to me that a lot of people are just ignoring or not really sitting with those things that are happening and how they're impacting them. So how they're impacting their minds, how they're impacting their spirits, and how they're impacting their bodies. And for me, I personally know that I carry stress and anxiety around all of those things. And I carry grief about the things that are going on in the world. And there often isn't space to really dive into that feeling and to really acknowledge that feeling for what it is.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's one of the reasons we're doing the work we do, and why I'm wanting to bring this conversation forward, because I do think there's fear connected to facing grief and also really acknowledging the harm that's happening in the world and because of dominant culture and norms that hurt people. Can you share some about the relationship between grief and liberation? Like, why might we need to make space to grieve, and how is that connected to freedom, joy, whatever words you would use to describe liberation, right? You might have a different word.
I think that when we can really acknowledge the harm that is being done, and we can really sort of sit with that and sit with the loss and the losses that we're all experiencing, and we can sit with that together, then that it creates a sense of community. So we can feel like we're not alone. We can feel like we're not crazy, that this is actually going on, that it's actually impactful. And I think that that sense of community and that sense of connection that we have with one another, a sense of connection that we feel towards the earth, towards animals, towards our neighbors, our brothers and sisters, towards people that don't look like us and people that don't worship like us. I think that that's what leads to liberation and can lead to collective liberation. And so I think that, first it really comes with like an acknowledgement that we are all in this together, and that these things that are happening are truly impactful, and that it's okay to grieve these things, and that doing so together, it lends itself to us really being in community with one another.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, because there's so much isolation, in response to what's going on. And I think there's also conditioning around us being isolated or needing to do things on our own, instead of actually being in space together to try to heal and connect, and find that liberation or freedom.
Right, exactly.
Can you share some lessons that you've learned from your own experience of grieving or acknowledging grief and what's going on in the world?
I think that I probably have two lessons that are very simple. And the first lesson, and this is a lesson that I had to teach myself that no one really taught me, but the first lesson is that there's no wrong way to grieve. I think that society really tells us that grief should happen in a very specific way. There should always be crying attached to it, and that it should only occur for certain losses and not other losses. Also that it should happen and it should be very quick. And after the funeral is over, if it happens to be a loss of a loved one, then you should move forward and you should move out of that grief process, and you should just go on and continue to live your life without an acknowledgement of the relationship that was lost there, and the fact that that is something that is extremely impactful. So that's really the first thing that grief has taught me, is that there's no wrong way to move through that process, and that I need to heal however it is that I need to heal, and everybody else needs to heal however it is that they need to heal. And it looks different for each and every single one of us. And the second lesson is that there's no avoiding it. That there's no avoiding the hard things. There's no avoiding the hard conversations. There's no avoiding those hard feelings. And when you try to avoid it, typically something will happen to make you confront whatever that thing is. And so for me with grief, there's been periods of time where I have definitely wanted to avoid feeling those big emotions, because I felt that I just need to keep it moving. I felt that I just need to continue to go on about the course of my day and the course of my life, and not feel that pain and not be weighted down because of a fear of what might happen if I really allow myself to feel that. But ultimately, my body is going to make me acknowledge it and recognize it and feel it and sit with it and deal with it. And that has happened to me. I've gotten sick because I think I have not allowed myself to really sit with these feelings of grief that I've had on different occasions.
Yeah, I mean, the body's wise, and it will slow us down and call us to pay attention, even as we resist. Like eventually it's gonna win, right? The body's wisdom.
Yes.
Is gonna win, which gives us an opportunity to then pay attention and actually think about how we might want to do things differently in the
Right.
in the
And,
future.
and I think it's so interesting when we think about things like grief or sadness, because, most of us are not typically denying our bodies other things. When our bodies need to sleep, we sleep. When our bodies need to eat, we eat. When we need to hydrate, we drink water. And those are all feelings that we feel in our body, and we know that we need to react to those in order to live. But when it comes to us really taking care of like our souls and our spirits, we try to do everything that we possibly can to avoid dealing with that sometimes.
Why do you think that happens? Like, why is that part of the human condition? Because I think it is part of the human condition. Like, what do you make of that? Why does that happen?
I think that happens because we're just not taught any better. I think that society and culture really doesn't hold space for us to deal with those big emotions. I think that, capitalism teaches us that we constantly have to be productive, and a productive person or rather, it's hard to be productive when you're dealing with a lot of pain, you're dealing with a lot of grief. It's hard to be productive. And so we talk ourselves out of really being able to sit with what we need to sit with. And actually, I think to be more productive, because we're more whole and we're allowing for healing to happen when we're going through these processes, but we're so afraid of what the outcome of going through these processes looks like. And it takes like reparenting as well, because I think that one thing that happens is, we don't see our parents grieve. And so we don't see our neighbors grieve. We don't see our teachers grieve. We see people going through these things and then ultimately just going back to work the next day, or doing what needs to be done, cooking dinner and taking care of families without really, and grieving behind closed doors. And so we don't see that as something that's in front of us. And so we don't think that it's something that's natural.
So I have often fantasized about getting t-shirts made that say, I'm grieving, just to normalize this experience that all of us have if we're alive, right? We're grieving something personally, or grieving in response to what's going on in the world and the harm that we've been talking about, the harm that's happening. And just to speak to what you said, I do think people need permission to grieve. It shouldn't be this way, but I think people need permission because dominant culture says, push through, do more, don't stop and feel, right? Or you just have 3 days to feel, right? And grieve, and then you need to show up at work. And that's not how grief works.
Right.
That's not how we process it. So I really appreciate what you said about just our conditioning around grief, and also how people grieve behind closed doors, or they don't grieve at all. And that's what we're watching and witnessing. So that's what we learn about emotion, right? And about grief.
And I think also not just about the loss of loved ones, but I think about that's also the way that we grieve about the things that are going on in society. We don't want to be the downers. We don't want to be the ones that are walking into the party, or that are at work or in community having these conversations. So we wait to have these conversations during times that are, quote unquote, appropriate, when we're at that meeting that's centered around social justice, or we're at that meeting that's centered around environmental protections, or we're at those meetings that are centered around voting rights or police brutality. And otherwise, we're not having those conversations. So we're just sitting with all of that on our hearts and in our minds, and with nowhere to really voice those things unless it's considered to be an appropriate time.
Yeah, there's a time and place, and that's not how grief works, though. It's like,
right,
it is always present for people. We just haven't been conditioned to talk about it and let it surface.
Exactly.
So are there ways that rituals or practices you engage to move through grief and to find liberation, or connect to your sense of ease and freedom?
So if it's related to a loss of a loved one, then it usually involves, so first of all, I speak to my ancestors. So it involves prayers. It involves speaking to my ancestors, praying to my ancestors, praying to my higher power. It also involves, lighting candles, building an altar, pulling divination cards, journaling, meditating. Those are all rituals that I engage in when I'm dealing with the loss of a loved one. I also like to hear stories or tell stories about that person. And I like to listen to music that I know that person really enjoyed listening to. And I like to look at pictures of those people. And so that's how I deal with typically loss of a loved one. And if it has to do with something that I'm feeling about something that's going on in society or something that's going on in the world, it's a lot of those same processes. It's actually, I think I mentioned before, it's a lot harder for me to talk about those processes to other people, but it involves a lot of the same things. It involves a lot of journaling, a lot of, sitting with the situations, thinking deeply about them and thinking about ways that I can try to be a light bringer, or that I can shed light, or that I can speak truth to some of those issues. That personally helps me feel better. Yeah, that's a lot of what it is.
And what, given what we've said about how people are conditioned to not grieve or make space for it or to do it behind closed doors, how did you learn how to make space for the practices you just named? Like, what allowed for that to happen?
A lot of reading, a lot of really connecting with other like-minded people has really made that possible for me. Building community has made that possible for me. You being one of those wonderful people. Because otherwise I don't really think that I would have known. Again, it took a whole reparenting process, because it is not something that I was ever taught to do by my immediate family. It's these are things that I was taught to do by my chosen family. And also just really, again, once I learned to meditate and I started to practice mindfulness and I started to practice yoga, that really helped me to connect with my body, and it helped me to be able to connect with what it was that I needed. So it also involved a process of trusting myself and really trusting what it is that my body needed and what it is that my spirit needed, and then giving myself permission to do whatever that thing was.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, so you're talking about intuition and tuning in and listening, and then responding, right, based on what you hear back from your higher self, from your intuition, from your wisdom, your deep knowing.
Exactly.
And what might it look like, or what could it look like if in dominant culture, or just if we created our own spaces, really to collectively grieve? Like, what conditions need to be in place for us to be able to grieve and find freedom through that process of grieving together?
So I think it takes those of us that are already comfortable having those conversations and already comfortable with the grieving process, whatever that looks like to us. It takes us holding space for other people. And maybe that means opening up our houses. Maybe that means opening up our places of worship, or asking for the coffee shop down the street, or the schools that we go to or that we work in, or our places of employment. It means really opening up those spaces and having those conversations with the people that have access to power to those spaces, having those conversations with them and saying, this is something that I really feel like is needed. I think that this is really needed for us to be healthy, and it's really needed for us to be whole. And you know what? If you're an employer, then your employees are going to be so much more productive if they're able to really experience grief in a healthy way. And saying to our parents and saying to our siblings and our neighbors, you know what? This is okay. So I think it's those of us that are already in tune with the fact that we're being sold a lie by dominant culture and by white supremacy. It takes us being a voice, and it takes us speaking truth, and it takes us trying to create conditions where we are asking for those spaces to be open to this process to happening. And then I think it's just going to be a trickle down effect. Just little by little, there are going to be more people that are having these conversations, and more people that are dealing with grief in a healthy way, and more people that are willing to then speak up for themselves, and then speak up on behalf of others.
Yeah, and what you just shared makes me just think about the conditions that are in place now that limit people's ability or capacity to thrive. Mm-hmm. And we know this isn't sustainable. And so something's gonna shift, like something has to shift. Mm-hmm. And there has to be a reckoning with what we know is happening to us, and what the harm we may be perpetuating, the harm we're experiencing. That's gonna have to be looked at, reckoned with, acknowledged. People are gonna have to look at where they're implicated in creating these conditions that don't allow people to thrive and be whole and full, right? And I think that while I would rather us, and I think we are, both are happening actually simultaneously. We're having this conversation and creating space and doing work to acknowledge grief and to support people in remembering their whole, right? We're doing that. And I think culturally things are shifting so much, and systems are breaking down in a lot of ways, and people are calling for power to shift. And I think that's going to, I don't want to say force people, but I think it's going to push people or propel us to be having a different conversation, which will involve grief. Like, it's going to involve, okay, this is what's really going on. This is what we have to contend with. This is what we have to talk about. So I think both, like, we're creating the healing spaces, and I think because there's a lack of healing, right? Mm-hmm. It's people are going to have to figure out a different way of being, and different, way of doing things.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I think so. And I hope so, because I think it's necessary. Again, I just really do think about all of those systems where things happen every single day that are traumatic and that are cause for grief, and people are not able to really experience that. And typically, and when I'm talking about that, just what automatically jumps to mind are places of employment. And when I think about school shootings in particular, I think about the impact that it has on students, the impact that it has on staff, and how little time really, in retrospect and in reality, that those individuals have to grieve before going back into situations where they have just experienced something that is life altering. And there's just an expectation that they're supposed to go back and continue their lives as normal, continue learning and continue teaching. And I also think about things that happen in communities, like violence that happens in communities, and including police brutality, and how people are just expected to continue to go to work and continue to live in their homes and continue to operate as if everything is normal. And these are not normal things. Or rather, I guess they are in a sense normal in the fact that they're happening on a regular basis, but they should not be happening. They should not be normal things.
Yeah, I really appreciate what you just said. It's how I talk about, like, the toxic culture, that we normalize things that are horrific, right? Mm-hmm. We're conditioned to do that. And that's what you're talking about. Like, these are normal because these things keep happening, but they're not normal at all, right? Both are true. Even if people are used to them happening, right, and aren't responding or changing things and conditions, it's not normal at all what's happening.
Right.
Which I think is an important practice. I think acknowledging that this is actually not normal, right, is a really important practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that it's really important, because I think that when we get into the habit of thinking like, oh, this is normal, this happens all the time, then we can sort of start to get into a habit of thinking, well, then there's nothing that I can do about it. Instead of holding both of those truths, that yes, it is normal and it should not be happening. And so what can I do about it? How can I impact change in, whatever this particular area it is that I'm passionate about or that I am holding grief around?
So earlier I asked you about the relationship between collective grief or making space to grieve and liberation. And I'm wondering what collective liberation means to you, what it looks like, how you practice it. Like, what does collective liberation mean to you?
I think it means a lot of what I said about community. I think that that's the only way that we're really all going to be free is when we're sitting in community with one another and we're all acknowledging the fact that we are all impacted. We're all impacted by police brutality, because even though this may not be something that happens to someone of your gender or someone of your race, when we are living in a police state and police are allowed to get away with this, then that impacts all of us, because it allows for conditions where we're all potentially in danger. When it comes to the environment, even though you may not particularly live in a place that seems like it's impacted by environmental issues or environmental factors, there's a potential for that if we don't place a check on the things that are causing the environment to be degraded. And so just like so on and so forth, that even though we may not be individually impacted by something, this acknowledgement that as a whole, we are all impacted by the things that are going on, then that allows for us to sort of all be in this place where we're working towards this common good. We're working towards creating a better world. We're working towards breaking down systems that don't benefit us. And that, I think, is what's going to lead to our collective liberation. And so I try to think about things like that. I try to think about things from a standpoint of, you know what, this doesn't necessarily impact me, but it could eventually impact me, and it impacts other people, and we are all connected. And so what can I do in this situation to help? What can I do in this situation to bring light? What can I do in this situation to speak to it? How can I educate other people? And I also think about my ancestors, and I think about the generations that are going to come after me and how they're going to be impacted if we continue to allow certain things to happen.
Yeah, I love what you just shared. And we were talking before we actually started recording about family, and my mom is not well. She's in the hospital right now. And I was talking about the staff at the hospital and just like, how did we end up here where people are not humanizing each other? Like what, even though I know that's what culture, the country's built on, like dehumanizing people, but that's not what humanity is built on. Like, that's not who we are. And so this idea that we're connected, which is not just an idea, it's a truth, right? What you named. And that you practice remembering that even if something's not directly affecting you, right? That you are still aware that it's affecting someone. And so is there room for you, or do you have agency in that moment to make some adjustment or change that might affect someone for the good, right? In a positive way. And I think, I was just thinking about the hospital. I think we just like forget that our actions matter. Every action, right, we take, they matter and they affect other people. And when we're dissociated and not feeling, we don't remember we're connected to others, or we're not even connected to ourselves in those moments. So yeah, I really appreciate what you named. I would love for you to share some about what is coming up in 2020 that you're excited about, and also to share about how folks can get in contact with you, and if there's anything else you want to share about grief and our conversation.
So in 2020, I'm currently in the process of planning several things. I'm planning healing circles and restorative yoga for healers and change agents and social workers. I'm also planning a yoga to manage your mood series. And one of the things I'm most excited about is the Healing and Community retreats that I'm co-facilitating with you and several other wonderful and skilled facilitators. And again, currently right now for those first two things, I'm in the planning stages, but those should be getting started in February and March of 2020. And people can get in contact with me via my website at pausebreatheconnect.com. They can email me at contact@pausebreatheconnect.com, and also follow me on Instagram and on Facebook.
I'm so excited for what's to come and all the amazing work you're doing in the world and the things you're creating, right, and bringing forward. And I appreciate you for being you, and yeah, just the way you show up in the world and in community. And I appreciate you, again, saying yes to this and yes to facilitating and just being on this journey of trying to make space for more healing for people. So thank you so much for being here. And is there anything else you want to share?
No, thank you for asking me. And thank you for opening up space to have this conversation, because I have not seen where it's being had anywhere else. And I think that it's so necessary, and it's so needed, and that the work that you're doing and that we're going to do around this are going to be so impactful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm excited about it. So thank you, Johnette. Good to see you.
Thank you. Good to see you.